Hello everyone and welcome to another episode with Coach B from MasterChess.com. In this video, we will continue to talk about same color bishops and we're going to take a look at the rear opposition defense, which will go over two more important positions that you absolutely need to know for this type of endgame. So let's get started. In the first video on the same color bishops, we saw that if the defending king was able to stand in front of the pawn on a square that has the opposite color as the opponent's bishop, he was able to easily draw the game. When the king is not able to reach one of those squares in front of the pawn, the best try is to get the king in rear opposition of the enemy king, from which together with the bishop, he will be able to fight against the pawn. And the rule is this: when the defending king has taken rear opposition, the ending is drawn if both diagonals controlling the square in front of the opponent's pawn are 4 or more squares long. If one of those diagonals is less than 4 squares, and the opponent can control those squares with the king and the bishop, then the game is lost. So let's take a look at those positions and see why. So in this first position, it's white to move, and we can see that here black has reached rear opposition, and we can see that both diagonals that cover the square in front of the pawn are at least 4 squares long. The first diagonal is 5 squares long, and the second diagonal is 6 squares long. Therefore, black should be able to get a draw here. And the reason why this draws is because the only square that will challenge the diagonal of the black bishop is the square b7, which blocks the pawn from marching forward. In the first video on this topic, we saw that in order for white to be able to win, he needs to be able to block the bishop on a square that does not block the pawn from marching forward. Well, this is not possible with the kings in rear opposition. Even in the most favorable position, here white would not be able to step on the square c6, as black can simply capture that bishop, as he has support from the black king, and white cannot capture back. Therefore, a draw will be achieved. Coming back, I do want to mention that even if white would challenge the opponent's bishop from the square c8, he would not be able to win this game, as the black bishop can simply capture on c8, because after white captures back, the black king will be able to capture the pawn on c6. So therefore, this game will be drawn. So let's go to a possible continuation of this position. So after bishop to d7, here black does not want to capture the bishop because that will lose the game. He's going to retreat the bishop to f1. After to something like bishop to g4, black will respond with bishop to b5. Again, all that black wants to do is wait for the pawn to reach d7 so he can sacrifice the bishop, as white will not be able to checkmate with just the king and bishop. So after this, white will respond with bishop to d7, challenging that diagonal again. If bishop retreats to e2, let's try bishop to c6 here, retreating on the other diagonal. Well, now black will simply respond with bishop to g4, and white cannot make any progress, and a draw is achieved. So in this next position, it's white to move, and also we can see that one of the diagonals that covers the square in front of the pawn is less than 4 squares long. It's only 1, 2, 3 squares long. Also, the white king covers the squares a6 and b7, while the white bishop covers the square c8. Therefore, here white should be able to win this game. So let's go ahead and see the correct play. So after bishop to c8, let's say black will respond with bishop to e4, still covering the square b7, not letting the pawn march forward as he's going to sacrifice the bishop to reach a draw. After something like bishop to b7, challenging that diagonal, bishop to d3. After this, white will respond with bishop to f3, and now bishop to a6, covering the square b7, from which white will respond with an excellent move, bishop to g4. And now black is in zugzwang. If he moves the bishop to b7, the white king will simply take it. If he moves the bishop to c8, still covering the square b7, well, here he's going to be captured by white's bishop. So all he's got is retreating the bishop or retreating the king. If he retreats the bishop, let's say bishop to d3, well, the pawn will march forward and then he will promote and white will win the game. Coming back, if instead of retreating the bishop, black will move the king, the only square that black has is the square b5, where he could still protect the bishop on a6, but even this doesn't work, because after this, white will respond with bishop to e2 check, and the king will have to move away, from which white will capture the bishop, winning the game. So coming back from the very beginning, after bishop to c8, bishop to e4, and bishop to b7, we looked at the bishop retreating to d3 here, A better reply for black here will be moving the bishop to f5 instead. Well, after this, white will respond with bishop to f3. After bishop to c8, still covering the square b7. Another excellent move, bishop to e2. Taking control of the square a6, not letting the black bishop get there, as white will simply capture the bishop. And now, if black retreats the bishop, let's say bishop to e6, well, white will simply march the pawn forward and then promote it on the next move, winning the game. So coming back, a better reply is moving the king. Well, as the square a6 and b5 are taken away from the black king, let's say he's going to move the king to b4. Well, after this, white has access to the square a6. And after bishop to a6, white challenges the diagonal on a square that doesn't prevent the pawn from marching forward. And after black retreats the bishop, let's say bishop to a6, white will be able to march the pawn forward, promoting it to a queen and winning the game. And in the end, I want to end up with an exercise to see if you've mastered this lesson. Here it's white to move, and we could see that here he needs to move the king as the bishop on d6 attacks the king on f8. So pause the video and think about how would you play this position. Okay, assuming that you thought about this position, I'm going to go ahead and go over the answer. Well, here we could see that one of the diagonals that covers the square in front of the pawn, it's less than 4 squares long. However, we know that in order to be able to win, white needs to be able to cover those 3 squares with the king and bishop. And if you thought about moving the king to e8 here, this will actually draw the game. So let's take a look and see why. After king to e8, black will respond with king to e6, taking rear opposition. After bishop to f8, challenging the diagonal of bishop, black will retreat, let's say bishop to f4. After something like bishop to b4, bishop to h6. And here, since the pawn is just 1 square away from promotion, white can try bishop to d2 to sacrifice the bishop. However, black will respond with bishop to g7, still keeping an eye on the promotion square. After bishop to e3, trying to put black in a zugzwang position. Well, here, black actually has a great move, king to d6. He wants to make sure that he keeps the bishop on g7 to prevent the pawn from promoting. After this, bishop to d2, or king to e6. Bishop to c3, challenge the bishop, bishop to h6. And white cannot make any progress. So coming back from the very beginning, the correct response is moving the king to g8, where the white king will cover the square f8 and g7. You want to make sure that the king covers most amount of squares on the diagonal in front of the pawn. So here, he's covering 2 squares, while the bishop will be able to cover the other square. After this, if black moves the king to g6, taking rear opposition, white will respond with bishop to f8, challenging the black bishop to move away. After something like bishop to e5, white just needs to retreat the bishop, let's say bishop to b4. After bishop to g7, an excellent move by white, bishop to d2, taking control of the square h6, while the white king covers the other 2 squares, f8 and g7. And now black is in zugzwang. If he moves the bishop to f8, white will simply capture the bishop and then win the game. The black bishop cannot go on h6 as the white bishop will simply capture it, and retreating the bishop will allow the pawn to promote and white will win the game. Trying to move the king instead while defending the bishop, it's still not going to work. The square h6 is taken from the black king as the white bishop attacks that square, and if the king moves to e6 instead, after bishop to c3, the black king is skewered, he's going to have to move away while white will win the bishop and also win the game. Alright, thank you so much for watching this video, and I encourage you to visit my website masteryourchess.com, where you will be able to practice these positions against the computer.